I'm joined now by Chris Horseman. He's an EU agricultural policy and trade consultant, and Victoria Hewson. She's senior counsel for the Legatum Institute's Special Trade Commission. That's a London-based think tank. Well, Victoria, start with you. This is great news, isn't it? An end to EU quotas in this particular product?
Well, any liberalising measure is to be welcomed, of course. Ultimately, the aim of a trade policy should be, it isn't always the case, but it should be to maximise the choice and quality available to consumers. So by taking away quotas, that's a step in the right direction. Unfortunately, in this case, it's a very partial measure and ultimately doesn't really meet that requirement of improving choice and value for consumers, because you still don't have the option to buy cane sugar without being controlled really by the tariffs and quotas that the EU has imposed.
Well, British Sugar would argue that actually they're protecting domestic sugar production against highly subsidised cane sugar production from places like Brazil and Thailand.
Well, yeah, and that's always a risk, of course, is that the playing field isn't quite level, but there are better ways of levelling the playing field and countering those distortions from highly subsidised markets than by the blunt instrument of sticking a quota on it, so limiting the amount of imports and also tariffs, so you increase the price of those imports. There are better, more sophisticated ways of doing that are more liberalising and improve consumer welfare by way of choice and price.
Which would be presumably bringing down tariffs more generally across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. Bring down tariffs and utilise better ways of countering distortions by examining what the effect of subsidies in those markets are. And if they're truly distorting and unreasonable, then you can look at deploying measures to impose tariffs there. All right,
well, let's bring Chris in at this point. I mean, Chris, this is the problem with a lot of what the EU has done, the common agricultural policy over the year. It's artificially kept food prices high.
Yes, it has, and sugar has been particularly badly distorted over the years. The sugar quota system, which has been in place for 49 years, which is now finally disappearing, has kept a lid on supply and has thus artificially kept prices up. But nothing in the sugar trade situation is ever straightforward, and you've got the situation where there are very heavy tariffs applied on imports of sugar from some countries, but not from others, because the likes of Tate and Lyle can import sugar from developing countries, Commonwealth countries, completely free of tariff. The problem is that countries like Brazil and Thailand can produce sugar more efficiently and much cheaper, and that's really what UK refiners would like to get their hands on.
There's a trade-off, though, isn't there? Because ultimately you do want an element of protection for British farmers, or do you?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is where the sort of the post-colonial politics of sugar trading bumps up against the politics of Brexit. There is, I think, in the UK a lot of sentiment towards being able to have access to free trade, but the problem in this case is that free trade will actually mean disadvantaging the British producer, which goes against the usual kind of pro-Brexit narrative, if we can put it that way. So basically, the UK government has got a very difficult decision to make, whether it increases access to imported cane sugar, or whether it continues to support domestic beet production. And it basically has to decide after Brexit which of those two parties it disappoints.
Go on, Victoria.
I think the issue there, of course, is by protecting British beet sugar producers, you're effectively protecting one monopoly supplier and suppressing more innovative suppliers who might be able to make better use of global supply chains, like, for example, Tate and Lyle would argue that they do. I think the days of controlling the products available on a market in order to protect domestic and vested interests should be long behind us. I think we've seen with the reaction to, for example, Uber having its licence suspended, consumers really do start got to value the choice and the innovations available to them, and we should be applying the same principles to our agricultural markets.
But very briefly, isn't there a case for saying farmers do an awful lot more? I mean, they look after the environment, they preserve the British countryside. You're putting all that at risk if you allow the country to be exposed to a lot of cheap imports.
Absolutely, and we certainly wouldn't argue for just pulling the rug away from farmers in an uncontrolled way. There is still a case to be made for making direct payments to farmers, but moving away from the more distortive land-based payments that operate under the CAP.
Very briefly, Chris, last word to you. Isn't there a case for saying that we should really tear down some of these EU quotas on the basis that we're hurting developing countries, we're preventing them from making a living in the global markets?
Yes, I mean, there's a very strong case to be made there. And what the British government has to decide is whether it's possible to reallocate the subsidies that are currently paid under the Common Agricultural Policy. After Brexit, it's got an opportunity to reformulate agricultural policy in such a way that the environment is protected, that food standards are protected, but that there isn't necessarily the same amount of money just going into giving farmers area payments because they've got the land.
All right, Victoria Hewson, Chris Horseman, thanks both.